There's a specific kind of tear your body produces only when you're not physically hurt. Not from cutting an onion. Not from wind or dust or a scratched cornea. A tear that shows up when you watch someone reunite with a parent they haven't seen in years, when a piece of music hits a chord you didn't expect, when you're simply, overwhelmingly happy or sad for reasons that have nothing to do with your eyes needing lubrication. No other animal on Earth does this. Not reliably. Not as a response to emotion itself. Elephants have been photographed with wet eyes during distress. Dogs' eyes can water. But controlled, well-designed studies looking specifically for emotionally triggered tears, tears produced because of a feeling rather than physical irritation, have never conclusively found this behavior anywhere else in the animal kingdom. As far as the current scientific record shows, you belong to the only species that cries because of how it feels, not just because of what happened to its eyes. That should stop you for a second, because it means something evolved here that didn't need to evolve. Basic tear production, the kind that keeps your eyes moist and washes out irritants, that's ancient, shared across nearly every land vertebrate, going back hundreds of millions of years. But emotional tears, the specific act of crying because you're sad, or moved, or overcome, appears to be something else entirely. Something layered on top of a much older system, for a reason evolution doesn't hand out for free. So who cried first? And why did a trait this specific, this seemingly impractical, survive when natural selection is usually ruthless about cutting anything that doesn't directly help an organism eat, escape, or reproduce? Let's start with the mechanism itself, because understanding what's actually happening in your body when you cry from emotion reveals something almost nobody thinks about. Your basal tears, the ones keeping your eyes lubricated right now as you're reading or listening to this, are chemically different from your emotional tears. Research comparing tear composition has found that emotional tears contain measurably higher concentrations of certain hormones and proteins, including prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and leucin and enkephalin, a natural pain-relieving compound. This isn't a minor chemical footnote. It suggests that emotional crying isn't simply basal tears triggered by sadness instead of dust. It appears to be a distinct physiological process, releasing substances associated with stress regulation and pain relief, specifically during emotional episodes. In other words, crying may be doing something to you internally beyond the visible act of tears running down your face. Some researchers propose that emotional crying functions partly as a mechanism for physically expelling stress-related hormones and metabolic byproducts that accumulate during intense emotional states. Essentially, a release valve your body evolved to relieve internal pressure that has nowhere else obvious to go. But that explanation, while compelling, only addresses one side of crying. Because crying isn't just something that happens inside your body. It's something that happens on your face, visibly, in front of other people, and that visibility is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Here's the detail that changes the entire conversation. If emotional crying were purely an internal release mechanism, something to regulate your own stress hormones, it wouldn't need to be visible at all. Your body could theoretically process and expel those hormones through sweat, through urine, through any number of private, undetectable pathways. Instead, evolution chose tears. Streaming down your face, reddening your eyes, changing your voice, making your distress or your joy unmistakably, publicly obvious to anyone standing nearby. That's not an accident. That's a signal. This brings us to what researchers call the emotional communication hypothesis of crying, and it reframes the entire trait as something that only makes evolutionary sense in a deeply social species. Humans, more than almost any other animal, survive and thrive through cooperation, through alliance building, through the ability to accurately communicate internal states to other members of the group, so that others can respond appropriately, offer help, adjust behavior, or provide comfort. Crying under this framework isn't a byproduct of sadness. It's a broadcast, a costly, hard-to-fake signal that says, unambiguously, something is happening inside me that matters, and I cannot easily hide it or perform it convincingly if it isn't real. This idea of a costly, hard-to-fake signal is critical to understanding why crying survived natural selection rather than being eliminated by it. In evolutionary biology, signals that are cheap and easy to produce are also easy to fake, which means other individuals eventually learn to ignore them because they can't be trusted. A signal only remains reliable over evolutionary time if faking it convincingly is difficult or costly. Try to cry on command, right now, without any genuine emotional trigger. Most people can't do it convincingly. Actors train for years to manage it. This difficulty isn't a flaw in the system. It's the entire point. Crying works as an honest signal, specifically because it's hard to counterfeit. Now let's go back further, because crying didn't appear suddenly in adult humans with fully formed social reasoning. It appears first, and most dramatically, in infants, and this is where its evolutionary origin becomes considerably easier to trace. A human infant is, biologically speaking, remarkably helpless. Compared to almost any other mammal, human babies are born in an extremely underdeveloped state, unable to walk, unable to feed themselves, unable to regulate their own body temperature effectively, unable to do anything at all except exist and communicate distress. And the primary tool available to a human infant for communicating distress, especially before language, is crying. Infant crying is loud, difficult to ignore, and specifically engineered by evolution through the acoustic properties of the sound itself to be aversive to adult listeners. Researchers studying infant cry acoustics have found that the specific frequency patterns of a distressed infant's cry trigger measurable physiological stress responses in adult listeners, including caregivers, that are difficult to consciously suppress. You cannot easily ignore a crying baby. That's not a parenting failure on your part. That's the sound working exactly as it was designed to work, by evolutionary pressure operating over enormous timescales, on infants whose survival depended entirely on getting an adult's attention immediately, every single time. This is where emotional tears likely have their deepest roots. Not in adult social nuance, but in the brutally simple survival math of an infant who cannot survive without triggering an immediate caregiving response. A baby that cried louder, more persistently, more effectively, got fed faster, got attended to faster, survived infancy at higher rates than a baby whose distress signal was weak or easy to overlook. Which means, over generations, natural selection was quietly favoring infants who were better at crying. Not emotionally more sensitive necessarily, but physiologically better equipped to produce a distress signal capable of overriding an adult's attention, even against competing priorities, even in the middle of the night, even when the adult is exhausted. Here's where it gets more interesting, because tears specifically, the visible, wet component of crying, appear to add something beyond the sound alone. Researchers studying the visual effect of tears on human perception have found that images of faces with visible tears are rated by observers as more sad, more in need of help, and more trustworthy in their distress, compared to identical faces with the tears digitally removed. The tears themselves are doing communicative work, separate from facial expression or vocal sound. They are, in a very literal sense, a visual amplifier for a distress signal that might otherwise be ambiguous. Think about what this means evolutionarily. A crying face without visible tears can be mistaken for anger, discomfort, or simple crankiness. But a face with tears streaming down it is almost universally, cross-culturally, immediately recognized as an expression of distress or overwhelming emotion, one that reliably reduces perceived hostility in observers and increases their instinct to help or comfort rather than confront. This has been documented across dramatically different cultures with limited historical contact, suggesting the Terra's signal isn't a learned cultural convention that happened to spread. It's closer to a universal human feature, deeply embedded, likely present in some form long before recorded history, possibly present before modern Homo sapiens existed as a distinct species at all. Now, here's the layer that almost nobody discusses when talking about crying, and it fundamentally reframes vulnerability as something with a specific evolutionary function rather than simply a weakness to be managed. For crying to function as an honest, trustworthy signal, it has to be somewhat difficult to control. And here's the uncomfortable part. That same difficulty, the fact that you generally can't simply switch crying off by deciding to, is precisely what makes it useful as a signal in the first place. But it's also what makes it feel, subjectively, like a loss of control in situations where you might desperately want to maintain composure. This tension appears to be intentional from an evolutionary design standpoint, even though nobody designed it consciously. A signal that you could switch on and off at will, the way you can choose to smile or frown, would be far less trustworthy to observers because it could be performed strategically, deployed to manipulate rather than genuinely communicate. The involuntary nature of crying, the fact that it often arrives despite your best efforts to suppress it, is exactly what preserves its value as an honest signal across an entire species that has every incentive, individually, to fake emotional distress when convenient. You've inherited a communication system that is, by design, resistant to your own conscious control, because a version that wasn't resistant would have stopped working as a signal generations ago. Let's widen the lens further, because there's a social dimension to crying that goes beyond individual infant survival, and it connects directly to something researchers have observed in adult human social bonding. Studies on crying behavior in social contexts have found that witnessing someone cry, particularly someone within your existing social circle, triggers measurable increases in prosocial behavior directed toward that person. Observers report increased feelings of empathy, increased willingness to offer comfort or assistance, and in some experimental contexts, increased willingness to share resources with the person who cried, compared to control conditions where the same distressing information was communicated without visible tears. This suggests crying functions, at a group level, as a mechanism for eliciting cooperation and support, specifically during moments of vulnerability, when an individual most needs the group's resources or protection, but may be least able to demand it directly. A wounded, grieving, or overwhelmed individual who cries is, in effect, recruiting the social support of the group around them, without needing to explicitly ask, negotiate, or perform strength they don't currently have. In small, tightly knit ancestral human groups, where survival depended heavily on mutual aid and reciprocal support, an honest signal capable of reliably triggering group assistance during genuine crisis would have been an enormous advantage, both for the individual crying and, interestingly, for the group as a whole. Since groups that respond effectively to genuine distress signals within their ranks tend to maintain stronger internal cohesion and higher overall survival rates than groups that ignore or punish vulnerability. This reframes something most people think about crying entirely backwards. Crying isn't a breakdown of social functioning. In evolutionary terms, it may be one of the most socially functional behaviors humans possess, specifically because it operates outside voluntary control and therefore cannot be easily weaponized or faked at scale. Now, here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because if crying is this evolutionarily useful, this deeply embedded, this cross-culturally universal, why does so much of modern human culture actively suppress it, particularly in certain contexts and for certain people? This is where biology and culture start pulling in noticeably different directions, and understanding that tension tells you something important about the gap between what your body is built to do and what your environment currently rewards you for doing. Anthropological and psychological research examining crying norms across different societies has found significant cultural variation in when, where, and by whom crying is considered acceptable. In many industrialized, individualistic cultures, particularly in professional and public contexts, crying is frequently coded as a loss of composure, competence, or emotional control, especially for men, and especially in high-status or high-stakes settings like workplaces, courtrooms, or public leadership roles. This cultural suppression creates a strange and measurable conflict. You have an ancient, deeply wired biological signal, one specifically evolved to be difficult to consciously suppress because suppression would undermine its function, colliding directly with modern social environments that actively punish its expression. The result, documented extensively in psychological research on emotional suppression, is that forcibly suppressing crying doesn't eliminate the underlying physiological stress response. It just prevents the natural release mechanism from completing its function, while the internal hormonal and neurological activity continues regardless. Studies on habitual emotional suppression have linked it to measurably worse outcomes across a range of indicators, including elevated baseline stress hormone levels, reduced quality of close relationships, since suppression tends to create emotional distance from others, and increased self-reported psychological distress over time, compared to individuals who allow themselves to cry when the underlying emotional trigger genuinely warrants it. In other words, the modern instinct to view crying as weakness, to treat it as something to be controlled, hidden, or apologized for, appears to work directly against a system that spent an enormous span of evolutionary time being refined specifically, because open, honest emotional signaling improved survival and social cohesion within groups. You're not overcoming a primitive impulse by suppressing tears in high-stakes situations. You're actively working against a communication system that likely helped keep your ancestors, and the groups they depended on, alive. Let's bring this back to something extremely specific and personal, because by now you should be noticing a pattern in how deeply this connects to moments in your own life. That specific tightness in your throat, the one that shows up right before tears do, when you're watching something moving, or receiving unexpected kindness, or finally processing grief you'd been holding at a distance, that sensation has a name in physiological research. It's often referred to informally as feeling a lump in your throat, and it corresponds to a real, measurable muscular response, a tightening of the muscles around your glottis in anticipation of crying, occurring as part of the same activated stress and emotional response system responsible for tear production itself. That sensation isn't random. It's part of an ancient, coordinated physiological sequence, one that likely predates language, predates complex culture, and possibly predates modern Homo sapiens as a distinct species. When you feel that tightness and fight to hold back tears in a meeting, at a funeral trying to stay composed for someone else's sake, or during a moment of overwhelming happiness you feel embarrassed to fully express, you are wrestling with a signal system that has been refined over an almost unimaginable span of evolutionary time, specifically because it worked. So who cried first? We don't know their name, obviously, and we never will. But somewhere deep in the evolutionary lineage that eventually produced modern humans, an ancestor's distress vocalization began pairing, gradually, generation after generation, with visible tears, and that pairing turned out to be extraordinarily useful. Infants who cried more effectively survived at higher rates. Adults who could read tears accurately, who responded to them with help rather than indifference, built stronger, more cohesive social groups. Groups with stronger internal cooperation outcompeted groups without it. And the trait, refined continuously by these pressures across an enormous span of time, eventually produced you, sitting or standing wherever you are right now, carrying a communication system in your body that is considerably older and considerably more sophisticated than most people ever stop to consider. You didn't inherit crying as a weakness. You inherited one of the most honest, hardest-to-fake communication systems evolution ever produced, refined specifically because groups that could trust each other's genuine distress signals survived better than groups that couldn't. Every time you fought back tears in a moment where you felt you couldn't afford to show them, you weren't overcoming some embarrassing biological glitch. You were suppressing a system that spent millions of years being perfected for exactly the opposite purpose, because somewhere back in your evolutionary history, being able to say, unmistakably and without words, "This is real, and I need you to see it," was the difference between a group that held together and one that didn't.